Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure for me to be here. I've been a member of I think it's called the Academic Council, or external board, advisory board of the HCIAS here in Heidelberg for a few months. But it's really special to be able to visit and see what you're doing here and get to know the city that I've been visiting once before, but that's many years ago. So in order for you to get to know me a little better, I decided to give a presentation that is based on actually a few different research projects, and it's also a kind of testing out some ideas. So that's what I'm going to do, and some kind of concepts that I feel that captures well the issues that I've been studying for a few years. So I brought in two photos here. One is President Nicolás Maduro of Venezuela and his entourage, and the other one is Nayib Bukele of El Salvador and his brothers. And so what do these really have in common? I mean, the Venezuelan regime and government is very often spoken about as socialist. Nayib Bukele's policies and regime are more often talked of as right-wing, although it's kind of difficult to place it in a specific category. What we hear mostly about in the case of El Salvador is his policies to crack the gangs, and his Bitcoin experiment, and not so much about what's really kind of the economic model that he's trying to implement. And the way it was mentioned that I've been leading 3 research projects. One is on the role of China in Latin America. The other one has been on the relationship between small and medium-sized businesses and violent gangs. And the other one is really just something we've thought of ourselves. We haven't received much funding on it, but it is on the Venezuelan kind of transition that we're calling it. And Venezuela is going through many transitions, not so much a democratic transition that many have hoped for, but there are a lot of things happening on the ground level. So I'm going to throw out some a set of ideas, and I'm really eager to hear your comments and have a discussion. So I'm going to try not to be too long. So this is not only sort of there's a photo of me and of my co-author Manuel Sutherland, but it's not kind of the holidays. I'm not going to show you all my holidays photos from El Salvador and Venezuela, but just to bring your thinking towards a Latin American economy. Some of you have worked in Latin America, maybe some of you are from some country in Latin America. And the first thing that maybe would strike you is sort of this photo here, a stall selling fruits on the street. It could be food, it could be other things. It is kind of the informal economy. It is what keeps the sort of urban wheels going. It's people selling things on the street, bringing it in from the farms around, or in other ways. It could also be this little pupuseria. Maybe some of you know El Salvador. You would know that pupusas is kind of the national dish. It's a little pupuseria. It's actually in Bitcoin, what they call Bitcoin Beach. So you see that we take Bitcoin, but the sort of Bitcoin thing is a sideshow. This is mostly everybody pays in dollar, in cash. But it's a sale of pupusas. But there's other things that are to be noticed. The photo up on the left corner here, I haven't taken myself. I normally don't hang out in that kind of fancy bars, but it is taken in 2020 in Venezuela, and that was at the depth of the economic crisis. And there were still a lot of fancy bars around. There were people having a lot of money. You saw fancy new cars. There were even Teslas brought into to Venezuela, although some sort of Some ironic comments were made that I hope they have a diesel generator to charge it, because there's blackouts every so often. So it would be hard to charge an electric car. And there were new fancy buildings being built in the midst of this dire economic crisis. And the other one photo here on the right corner, I also haven't taken. It's from a commercial, but that's from El Salvador. And that is also part of the reality, this elitist economy. But this one is obviously, it's not taken by me, but it's from Venezuela. It's also from around 2019, at the depth of the crisis, where you saw new shops all of a sudden being opened. And this one, I'm not sure if you can guess where the investors for this one is from. Some of you, I believe, speak Spanish. Damasco. It's Syrian. It's Syrian investors. And they sell home appliances at outrageous prices. So the big question is kind of, how does this all hang together? What is it that makes this kind of, these forms of economies, how do they work? And there's so many similarities. How come one is called socialist and the other is called right-wing? What is actually what's the similarities behind these kind of economies, and what are the differences, if any? Or obviously there are many differences between El Salvador and Venezuela. I should perhaps say before I move on that my interest in Latin America, or sort of was one of the things that I've been studying over many years, is Latin American elites. And the reason why I study that is that I've been interested in that is a little bit of a coincidence, but it's also that I've always been interested in who really has the power, and how do they exercise that power, and what are the systems built to support their kind of influence in society. I got interested in that. I'm not going to tell my whole life story, but because I did my PhD on privatization of telecommunications in Central America. Pretty odd topic for a European, but this was the late 1990s, where all the sort of semi-radical solidarity involved kids. We were against the structural adjustment programs, and we thought that the World Bank and the IMF, they were eating babies in Africa and worse. And so I wanted to study their role in the privatization in Central America, and I ended up studying the interests of the elites, how they shaped the policies, how their interests were much more influential than the banks in Washington in the way these things actually were carried out. So I brought that interest in elites in various different new projects, and also a bit in this. And when I was studying all that, what I came to, the concept that I found most kind of descriptive, so that described what was going on best, was authoritarian capitalism. And that is a concept that has been used by many in many very different ways. You have at least 4 different interpretations of it in the literature. And they were, of course, linked to very different realities. So one is simply kind of a capitalist system in an authoritarian context. And so I brought in a picture here of Augusto Pinochet in Chile that introduced in a deeply authoritarian regime, a kind of completely liberalized economy, but of course everything but a liberalized political system. And that was done very dramatically, and most of us know a little bit about that whole story, how it generated dire poverty, generated a deep economic crisis in the 1980s, but also transformed the country and created a Chilean model that has over time generated a bit of economic growth. And I'm not going to go into the Chilean system, but the essential idea here is simply that authoritarian capitalism is capitalism in a concept of a sort of outright authoritarian regime. So that's one interpretation of it. The second is popularized, I would say, mainly by Peter Bloom, and he argues that even in nominally or actually democratic context, you have a kind of a developed as kind of capitalism that there are so many decisions about society that's taken out of the kind of the realm of what is decided by democracy. You have a global capitalist system. There are so many economic decisions that there's no debate about. There can't be any debate about that because there needs to be a continuation of the capitalist system. So that is what this, I just put up this photo from Occupy Wall Street, and that is pretty much what they're arguing against. We need to take back the power to decide our own economic system. So that is a second interpretation. Then there's a third interpretation, and that is pretty much a kind of a state capitalist system. And I put up here Deng Xiaoping and the Chinese Party Congress, Deng Xiaoping, who introduced the economic reforms to China that allowed a kind of capitalist economy to emerge, but within, of course, an authoritarian system and a very strong state. What this kind of understanding of authoritarian capitalism problematizes is the distinction between the state and the market. So you have a number of state-owned enterprises, but they're kind of competing in a market. You also have private enterprises, but they're very much state-controlled. So you have a state-controlled market. To do that, you need a rather strong state and a kind of institutionalized state. As Fukuyama has said, you need a rule by law, not a rule of law, because the law has no independence, but you need to have kind of rules that controls society, that also controls the market. So that is the fourth understanding. And I think all of these are very useful, but they're different from the understanding that I will kind of base my presentation on. And that is more linked to, so here you see Putin and his oligarchs. And nobody would argue that Russia is a democratic country, but I think you can have authoritarian capitalism also in kind of nominally, at least partially democratic countries with at least some election and a few other features. But this is distinguished not so much by the kind of transgression of the distinction between the state and the market, but you can have that too, but not necessarily, but more a transgression between the public and the private sphere. And that is different because that entails much less rules and regulations. It entails that people in public offices also use those offices for private benefits. We've heard quite a bit of sort of how that functions in Russia, but other examples would be Hungary under Viktor Orban, and I would argue that also Venezuela and El Salvador have many of these features, although the road to this kind of authoritarian capitalism in those two contexts have been very, very different. So what do I mean with this kind of authoritarian capitalism? I should mention that I've developed these ideas jointly with my co-author Antulio Rosales, and we have one paper out. I'm going to show a few ideas on how sanctions led to the emergence of authoritarian capitalism in Venezuela, which is a part of the story there, but we also have a couple of others coming out. So when we started to think about that, we found it very useful to go back to a kind of theoretical approach that was more popular 20 years ago, which is, let's see, no, I think, yeah. I'll say a little bit more about this before I start to talk about what's kind of the foundations of our theory. So we define then authoritarian capitalism as a system in which the market regulates most transactions. So there is a kind of there is a capitalist economy, there is a market, most transactions occur for profit. So most people need to go out there in the market. When you go out to the streets and buy from the streets vendors, they participate in the market. And they need to make some profits, not a huge profit, but they need to make some profit in order to survive. So there's some basic capitalist dynamics here. And that is also driven by the desire for private wealth accumulation. But there's big differences in who is able to accumulate wealth in this kind of system. Another feature is that institutions are weak, and that is how it differs very strongly from the Chinese form of authoritarian capitalism. And also that social rights are curtailed. You don't have, as in other systems, very strong, for example, labor unions or other actors that are able to assert their rights, and there are very little legislation that is at least legislation that is respected, that fulfills those rights. But in this, although there's a market for most things, market positions and assets are distributed by the government to ensure loyalty. At least those kind of positions that can contribute to accumulate wealth. And so the whole logic of the system is driven by the rulers' intent to stay in power. It is very difficult to understand those systems if you think that policy making is made to maximize the development or economic growth in the country. That can also happen, but the logic is to stay in power. And that regulates and constitutes exceptions from the market. And here I already reveal kind of our influence from the varieties of capitalism literature. That was originally established in order to argue that a kind of German, Scandinavian model of growth could also lead to sustained growth. It wasn't just a kind of Anglo-Saxon system. This is early 2000s, with that the Anglo-Saxon neoliberal model was very much the model, sort of generally accepted model towards growth. So the varieties of capitalism literature emerges to show that that kind of model has in that kind of model there are some specific synergies between the different institutions that regulate the market that leads to growth. But there are other models that can also lead to that. And that is what they argue is the sort of the more kind of Central European German model. They were also very concerned with that in that model there are some spaces that are taken out of the capitalist logic. So not everything is not everything is regulated by the market, and not everything is driven by a motive of profit seeking. For example, in Norway, where I come from, the school system is free, it's public, it's not run by a capitalist logic. Or the health system is also taken out of that sphere. What we argue here is that also in this kind of authoritarian capitalism, there are some spheres that are taken out of that kind of capitalist logic. But the purpose of that is to sustain the leaders in power. And it's not necessarily the health sector. For example, in Venezuela, there's officially a public health sector, but it does not work. If you go to the hospital with a serious disease, you will be sort of asked, if you can meet me at the private clinic in the evening and pay me $5,000 and I can fix that, or you can sit there and wait. And that's a bit characteristic. They're not necessarily always like that. But the idea here is that what the spheres that are taking out of this capitalist logic is due to other purposes than the public interest. Yes, I think I've said this already. And I also said a little bit about the theoretical framework, and I'm soon going to get to the... So what we built further on is Benedict Schneider that took this varieties of capitalism literature and developed it into kind of negative growth models. He also argued that there's, in Latin America, you have these kind of institutional complementarities, but they lead towards less growth and not more growth. And he had identified some structural features about that and sort of explained how do the sort of combination of very hierarchical business groups as well as transnational companies lead to a channeling of the wealth towards the top. So we argue that these negative complementarities, they produce a basic political stability and rising inequalities, but they also, but at the same time as rising inequalities. And we combine that with the developmental state literature, which is also kind of old literature that focused on what features of the state generates growth through linking policy making to being embedded in the society and in especially business communities, while also being able to have some kind of independence from them. That requires, on the one hand, solid state institutions, and on the other hand, groups in the state institutions that are able to pursue policies and implement them independent of pressures from society, to have some kind of societal, to be independent, somehow independent of societal elites. In these cases that we're looking at, we argue that low state capacity and predatory elites lead to a radicalized form of abstraction and social exploitation. So, let's go to Venezuela and El Salvador. And I'll start with Venezuela. I said in the sort of outline for this talk that I would look at what has been the road to this authoritarian capitalism in Venezuela, and what are the consequences? Venezuela and El Salvador, and what are the consequences? In Venezuela, there's also another big question that is very interesting, and that is how has the Maduro government managed this stability for so long? And we think that the development of this model actually explains in part that. But we argue that the Venezuelan, the authoritarian capitalism in Venezuela is the result of a transition from an economy of controls known as rentier socialism. Venezuela, as most of you know, is an oil-producing country, and since it started its oil production in the 20s, much of the political institutions and the economic wealth has been based on extracting the rents. And since Hugo Chavez came to power in 1999 and established a new model for distributing that rent, this model has been called rentier socialism. It was based on a number of different regulations, very importantly, the subsidization of dollars that to distribute to both people and not least businesses, to allow for the import of cheap food, and that was supposed to assist poor people to have access to food, to other goods. It led to a very corrupt system. It led to inflation because, and it led to the lowering of internal capacity. But that system started to change. It starts in 2014, I would say, with the drop of oil prices that created the first real economic crisis in Venezuela. And then there's a series of events that triggers an even deeper crisis. And I'm going to go through some of those in more detail. But in this system, we argue then that that have emerged is that economic opportunities are dependent on political loyalty with party-state structures. What you had from, I'm just going to take a little, if I'm going to go there. Yeah. When the crisis struck in 2014, the first kind of the first reaction was to print more money in order to alleviate the crisis. That created inflation, and it deepened the crisis, and it created a scarcity of goods, and that was when the Venezuela were on the news in Europe. There's no toilet paper left in Venezuela, and we got all these kind of news from Venezuela. The government's reaction to that was first to start some kind of liberalization, and then came 2017, and that was when the US started to introduce sectoral sanctions against Venezuela, because due to all of these scarcities, the economic problems, there were massive demonstrations in Venezuela. The opposition gained the majority of the National Assembly in 2015. That created a reaction from the government. It was a stalemate, and the government established a constitutional assembly that overruled all the decisions by the National Assembly. So that is when the government, the Venezuelan regimes take the step from being kind of, there's all sorts of concepts of sort of what is the hyphenated democracy. So it takes a step from being the hyphenated democracy towards being a more authoritarian regime when it sets aside the National Assembly. And that is when the US introduces sectoral sanctions. Those sectoral sanctions created an immediate crisis, and it created hyperinflation. Inflation went from several 100% to over 1,000, and then to 1,000,000% according to some accounts, not all. And there was a scarcity of money, and to be in Venezuela at the time was absolutely, everything was scarce. There was no money, there was no food, there were long lines for everything, and it was a complete crisis. I was there in August 2007, and maybe some of you have lived there or been there. It was a ghost city, and everything was difficult. The regime then reacted with what some economists have argued is a more dramatic structural adjustment program than any neoliberal economist would dare to think up. It started with a liberalization of the currency exchange, because it was prohibited to use dollars in the economy. It was prohibited to privately, it wasn't prohibited to use dollars, but it was prohibited to privately exchange them. So it was very limited use of dollars. It was a scarcity of money. They started with that liberalization, and then started with liberalizing trade. The result was, or partly liberalizing trade, and continued with a rather haphazard privatization program. And considering that inflation also then kept wages at around $5 a month, due to inflation, of course, but it was also a complete sort of eradication almost of the public wages. In that context, of course, this is a complete change of the economic structure in the country. So the question that we then ask is, how do people survive that in that context, and what is driving it? I'm sorry that I'm jumping a little bit of this. Yeah. This is more sort of on the question of authoritarian consolidation. Why is that happening? And the argument is often heard why it's consolidated. It is because it has the support of the military. we argue that what can explain it, well, at least you need an additional explanation, and that is the development of this kind of very unorganized capitalism. These are some of the papers. I can pass that on later. Wait a second. I think I'm going to go straight. This is just yeah. Okay. I think we'll jump to this one. In this kind of what happened then when the government all of a sudden liberalized part of the economy. One thing to remember about that liberalization is that some of it was in law and some of it was just by kind of exceptions. For example, there were made major exceptions to the import tariffs. You were allowed to buy containers full of goods from anywhere and sent it directly. It was called puerta a puerta. So the first kind of visual sign of this liberalization was the emergence of so-called bodegones. Little stores, they started out being little stores that sold Nestle, cafe. There was all sorts of goods you could think of from particularly from the US. I actually found Norwegian salmon in portions with the Norwegian text was on. So it was not produced for export, that was clear. It was some goods that some people had managed to buy somewhere else and sent to Venezuela. It started out with little stores. They grew and grew and grew. And last time I was in Venezuela, that was in January, there were enormous supermarkets with lots of goods that have entered Venezuela, much of it with exemptions from tariffs in order to, the reason was obvious. It was in order to be able to feed, to provide goods to the population, and these goods mainly to the more wealthier part of the population, of course, that could buy in dollars or in bolívares, but had significant amounts of bolívares. At the same time, autonomous union membership was curtailed. One of the main kind of policies was to keep the power of the unions low. And while for the last years we haven't heard so much about mass demonstrations in Venezuela, but there's been a lot of little demonstrations, and that has been organized by different unions, or in many cases by jubilados, which is pensioners that have seen their pensions almost scrapped. In addition to this, there were various different contracts and permits granted for public works and natural resource extraction based on loyalty and redistribution of elite support. This is from Arco Minero of Orinoco, where my colleague has worked. Our work started with the bodegones, and we went around and asked people sort of what were the prices, what were their, for how long had the bodegones exist, and many other questions. But Antolia has also worked in the Arco Minero, looking at both how sort of who are getting the grants to do this natural resource exploitation and what are they paying with. And we found that there's a lot of military involvement in informal and illegal markets that relies on a system of impunity and very much kind of top-down contracts. In addition, the government increasingly delegates tax collection and other regulatory fees to organizations that exercise local and territorial control. So a part of this kind of system of authoritarian capitalism is also to allow for different kind of state agencies to have powers beyond their actual kind of legal mandate. And you have what we've found in many of the little shops that we visited in Caracas, a kind of state-organized extortion. because you have, although there's agencies that are legally supposed to regulate these markets, they ask for additional fees, and they put up additional punishments. This is from an interview with one of those little shop owners. She argued that I was called to Senjat, which is the regulatory agencies, and imposed a fine at 10,000 euros. For some reason, they often fine them in euros. For accounting errors. I cried and tried to negotiate, and finally they brought it down to 8,000. But 8,000 euros, how can I pay for that? I still make payments, and I don't know for how long I will do. That was a person from the Guaycapuro market in 2022. And another very kind of important feature is this, is the opaqueness of the business-state relations. A part of this kind of authoritarian capitalism is dependent on the state being rather opaque. So it's not very predictable for most businesses, but there are openings where you can make money. And that the collection and handling of information and economic statistics and social data are centralized and handled as a state secret. If you look into the Central Bank of Venezuela looking for statistics, you will find a long list of important statistics, and there's no numbers that are newer than 2015, which is totally useless if you're going to understand what's going on in the market. And another important part of this is that business organizations are weakened. They call for dialogues and mechanisms of public-private cooperation and partnerships that produce access to resources and profit opportunities, but they are not allowed to influence policy at all. This is from the Vice President, Delcy Rodriguez, meeting with business in 2021. She now has a different position. And the government distributes rewards, but also punishments that go from limiting access to fuel or fines and threats to closure. This is kind of the other end of the story. It's Alex Saab, who is one of the closest confidants of Maduro. He is a Colombian businessman originally. He was running the sort of food distribution program. Then he was captured for corruption. It's been a long story involved in the international negotiations. But these have a kind of privileged access to the resources. And this is from a different interview. We negotiate access for gas oil for our plants every 3 to 6 months with the Zodi General and the government. With electricity failures happening 3 times per week, we depend on the gas oil supply for our operations. In this very weak institutional context, they need this kind of privileged access to different resources from the government in order to operate. So I think I'm going to start talking a little bit about El Salvador, but sort of our interpretation of all of this is that it is a market, it's a form of capitalism that opens spaces for capitalist accumulation, but very much kind of dependent on the loyalty to the regime. And it creates a system, it kind of creates a business sector that is forced to, in the end, be loyal to the regime and support it. So how does that, what is similar with the El Salvadoran case? The current regime of Nayib Bukele, as many of you probably know, it starts in a very different direction. There's no socialist policies. There's no kind of more strong regime controls such as the one that we have in Venezuela. Nayib Bukele started out as kind of working in public marketing in the Salvadoran context that since the civil war basically have been ridden by gang violence and with a government that has gone from being controlled by the economic elite and the arena party until it was handed over to the the party based on the former guerrilla, FMLN, in 2009, where they won the election. Or it wasn't they, it was the first president that had the support of the FMLN party that won the elections in 2009. But over those years since the end of the Civil War in 1992, the confidence in the government, the confidence in democracy, in political elites has deteriorated dramatically, not just because of gang violence, but also due to outright corruption. Then comes Nayib Bukele, argues that he has a completely different, some totally different ideas. He's going to save the country. He starts out in the FMLN party, but then eventually creates his own party, Nuevas Ideas. And because he had a totally new party when he came to power, he had very little support in Congress, and he needed to gain that support in order to introduce his policy. So how? But El Salvador, throughout that period, has also had kind of a rather liberal market-oriented model. Also, the left-wing governments supported by the FMLN did not make very big changes to that, in spite of the fears of the economic elite when the FMLN came to power. What Nayib Bukele needed was to get control over the political system. So what he did first was, and this was very kind of publicized across the world, that was when he brought the military into the Congress to force before he had strong support in Congress, to force the congresspeople to vote for his plan of national security and to fund his plan of national security. The second thing he did quite quickly in his term was to introduce Bitcoin as a legal tender. And that, of course, brought him worldwide fame. I don't know how many Bitcoin enthusiasts that have called me that wanted to know something about this fantastic country called El Salvador, where everything is going to change so quickly. My kind of interpretation of that is not that he's necessarily a super Bitcoin enthusiast, but he's a genius marketer. He knows how to create a kind of positive attention and to create the image of El Salvador as a very kind of forward-leaning modern country. Going to El Salvador, most people are still using dollars in cash. But the Bitcoin, it is taking up a little bit the use of the Bitcoin. But what he also did was to, of course, he cracked down on gangs, and most of you have also seen these kind of gruesome pictures from when he opened the mega prison outside of El Salvador and lined up the prisoners in order to kind of demonstrate his power and how he's going to make El Salvador a peaceful country. He did that to a certain extent. El Salvador is much more peaceful. You can walk. I've been working in El Salvador since 1997, when I came there first time to work with the gang issues, and nothing pretty much changed between 1997 and 2022. Of course, for Salvadoran people living in this, they would support pretty much anyone that would allow them to walk on the street, small businesses allowed to operate without being extorted. And so he got enormously popular. What he also did was to repress severely the old elites, the old economic elites. When they started to protest his policies in different ways and started to protest that they were not on the board. They were kicked out of boards of different institutions. They were not allowed to have a say in the way they used to do. He first attacked the president of the rather powerful Main Business Association, ANEP, Javier Siman, and this is just from a Twitter exchange between Javier Siman and Nayib Bukele. He has a tendency to go after people kind of on a personal level. So Javier Siman was also from a competing elite family from that of Nayib Bukele. It wasn't a coincidence that he went after Javier Siman and nobody else, because there had been feuds between those families for a long time. But it was personal. I know personally people that have been in former governments and are persecuted by him personally. And that is done in public, that is done in many other ways. The repertoire is not so different from what we've heard from other major leaders, Nicolas Maduro or even Donald Trump, that are persecuting people personally, but in a very small country with a very small elite like El Salvador, it created a lot of fear. And so most of the old elites have just adjusted to his agenda and do like this committee. Oh, so the picture of Nayib Bukele that there was cut off, they are lining up. They're not saying anything. Everybody is following his policies. At the same time, the sort of the rule that he has created is favoring not even a small elite. It's essentially, it is a small elite, but it is very much the Bukele clan that is now purchasing a lot of land. I've always been thinking when this whole Bitcoin thing started, sort of the way that Nayib Bukele has differed from many other kind of elites in power is that although he comes from a family that had some, they were running some businesses and sort of a part of the elite, but not among the super rich. So where should their fortune come from? What is kind of the plan behind this? I must say I was a bit surprised when it was revealed in this this journalistic investigation that they've started to buy up a lot of land in the country. And they've created a new coffee brand, Bean of Fire. It says created by Nayib Bukele. So, and this is also a lot of those, some of the other parts of the land is actually sugar growers. And this is thinking in kind of elite term. I think it's really interesting because Nayib Bukele comes from a kind of Arab part of the elites. And in most of Latin America, they entered at a period when the established elites were landowners. And they entered into sectors that did not compete with them. So they established banks, industry, commerce. And that was also what happened in El Salvador. Then their influence got more pronounced in El Salvador when a lot of the traditional elites had to flee during the civil war. But for that reason, I think it's so interesting that he uses the control of power to buy land, and massive amounts of land. So how does this what are the similarities between this system and the one that is developing in Venezuela? There's lots of differences. Of course, Venezuela is an oil economy. That is something that you always have to remember. But the systems are both built based on loyalty to the regime. It is one that opens for businesses, opens for market activities, but the main the main sources of accumulation, the main resources, the main contracts, the main permits, they rest on loyalty to a very, very small group, and a group that is getting smaller, particularly in Venezuela. That has been a regime run by a party and by the military, but the kind of group of loyalists are getting smaller. And in the system, there is still room for small businesses. There is still room to kind of survive as a more or less as a kind of a person that is trying just to make a living of what you're doing, but you are never going to be able to grow. It's been pretty well established that small and medium-sized companies in Latin America in general don't grow. They just stay small and medium-sized. And I think this kind of understanding of the economic, the intertanglements between the economic and the political logic helps us understand why that is so. So I think I'll stop there and rather have some discussions and comments. Yes?